130,000 women. That was the number of prisoners who passed through the gates. Some survived, most did not. Inside the camp, the female guards of Ravensbrück felt invincible in their gray uniforms. They held the power of life and death, but when the German front collapsed, that power vanished. Why did these women commit such atrocities? It was not just duty, it was a choice. Investigators later uncovered evidence of cruelty that shocked even veteran soldiers. The world demanded a trial. The result was a series of death sentences and public executions. The crowds who watched would remember the sight for decades. May 1939. Just months before the invasion of Poland, the Nazi regime constructed a new facility. They chose a site near the quiet lakeside town of Ravensbrück. It sat 90 kilometers north of Berlin. The location was strategic. It was isolated from the public eye, but remained connected to the main railway lines for easy transport. There was a key difference here. Dachau and Buchenwald held men. Ravensbrück had a different mandate. It was the only major concentration camp in the Third Reich designed exclusively for women. The first transport arrived in May. At first, the numbers were small. Only a few hundred prisoners occupied the barracks. These were mostly German nationals. They were political dissidents, communists, and socialists who had spoken against Adolf Hitler. Some were members of religious groups. The regime wanted them silent, but the scale changed quickly. As the German army moved across Europe, the camp expanded. The pace was staggering. Trains arrived from Poland, France, and the Netherlands. Later, women were shipped in from Norway and Yugoslavia. By 1942, the arrivals were daily. The camp became a city of prisoners. Historical records show that by the end of the conflict, the population included women from over 40 different countries. The footage from the liberation shows the reality. Squalid barracks, skeletal figures, massive piles of discarded shoes and clothing. There was no mistake. This was a factory for destruction. The guards tried to flee as the Red Army approached. They stripped off their uniforms and tried to blend in with the refugees. They threw their identity papers into the lake. But justice was faster. The British and Soviets began rounding up the staff. They focused on the SS-Aufseherinnen, the female overseers. These women had whipped prisoners and selected thousands for the gas chambers. In the courtroom, their faces remained cold. They claimed they were only following orders. The judges did not agree. It got worse. During the trials, survivors testified about medical experiments. Doctors had used the women as human guinea pigs. They cut open their legs and infected the wounds with bacteria and glass to test new drugs. The screams could be heard across the camp. The evidence was undeniable. The sentences were carried out in the courtyard of Hamelin prison. One by one, the guards who had once ruled Ravensbrück walked to the gallows. The story of the camp ended in the spring of 1945. The gates were torn down, the fires were extinguished, only the ruins remained. Thus ended the reign of the female guards. 130,000 women, 20 different countries. These were the numbers recorded at the gates of Ravensbrück. The reasons for their arrest were often trivial. Jewish women were seized for their identity alone. Roma women were targeted under racial purity laws. Members of the resistance were dragged here for smuggling messages, hiding fugitives, or sabotaging German machinery. Others had simply refused to work in Nazi factories or were caught in random street sweeps. The arrests were surgical. Families were torn apart in minutes. Mothers went to Ravensbrück while children were shipped to separate facilities. How was such a massive system managed? At first glance, a military operation, but in reality, a bureaucratic machine of terror. The camp required a massive workforce to maintain its brutality. Male SS officers occupied the highest command posts. However, they could not manage thousands of female prisoners alone. For daily operations, the SS turned to a new source of labor: women. At first, the numbers were small, a few dozen, then hundreds. By the middle of the war, female guards became the backbone of the camp's power structure. The recruitment process was disturbingly casual. Some women simply answered advertisements in local newspapers. Others heard about the openings from neighbors or family members already wearing the SS uniform. There were no high standards for entry. No military background was required. A formal education was unnecessary. The Nazi Party looked for only two things: absolute loyalty, and a willingness to obey orders. Why did they join? It was a question of survival and status. Most recruits came from poor working-class backgrounds. The job offered steady pay, a clean uniform, and 3 meals a day. In a country struggling under strict rationing, these benefits were a powerful magnet. The footage from the era shows the process. Young women arrived at the gates carrying small suitcases. Training took place directly inside the camp walls. New recruits learned the mechanics of the system. They practiced supervising roll calls and assigning heavy labor duties. They were trained to enforce discipline through physical beatings and solitary confinement. The objective was clear: break the spirit of every prisoner. Among the hundreds of guards, a specific group began to rise. These women were not just employees, they were the architects of daily suffering. Their authority was absolute. Their cruelty became the camp's new standard. But this was only the beginning. The camera records the result of their work: rows of exhausted women standing in the freezing cold. The sound of heavy boots on gravel was a constant. These female guards were no longer civilians. They had become a vital part of the killing machine. The story of the most notorious guards begins here. 1920. That was the year Dorothea Binz was born in the village of Templin. She grew up in a standard working-class household. Her formal education stopped early. By the time she reached adulthood, her career prospects were non-existent. Then, the Nazi Party rose to power. It offered a new direction for young women with no future. At 19 years old, Binz volunteered for the SS Women's Auxiliary. She was not drafted. She chose this path. The regime sent her immediately to Ravensbrück. Binz did not struggle to adjust to the camp environment. She adapted with immediate cold efficiency. She was disciplined and physically imposing. Violence became her primary tool of communication. Survivors remembered her clearly. She did not just walk. She patrolled the grounds with a leather riding crop gripped in her hand. Witnesses saw her smile while she struck prisoners. This was not a loss of control. It was a calculated display of authority. Her superiors noticed. Promotions followed quickly. Binz became the deputy head of guard training. This position gave her total influence over the next generation of female staff. Every new recruit learned from her. She taught them how to watch, how to strike, and how to destroy the will of the inmates. She turned brutality into a standardized curriculum. But this was only the beginning. The culture of the camp drew in others from different backgrounds. Greta Bösel arrived in 1944. By this time, the German military was retreating on all fronts. Bösel was a trained nurse. Her profession was defined by the preservation of life. In Ravensbrück, that training took a dark turn. The footage and records show a total inversion of medical ethics. Bösel worked as a guard, but her nursing background made her useful in the medical wing. She assisted in the experiments. These were not treatments. These were procedures designed to test the limits of human pain. Doctors performed surgeries that left victims permanently crippled. Bösel stood by and facilitated the process. The contrast was sharp. At first glance, a caregiver, but in reality, a functional part of the killing machine. There was no mistake in their choices. Binz and Bösel did not just follow orders. They refined the system of terror. One taught the guards how to hate. The other used medical knowledge to inflict permanent damage. Both women became pillars of the Ravensbrück system. The end was approaching. Mutilated or dead. That was the result of her oversight. Greta's manner remained cold and detached, showing no mercy toward the sick or the elderly. Survivors remembered her for a specific action. She walked the rows of inmates and selected those deemed too weak to work. She signed the papers. She sent them away. Everyone knew they would not return. At the top of the medical hierarchy stood Elizabeth Marshall. She was the camp's head nurse. On paper, her role was medical administration. In reality, she controlled life and death for thousands of women. Her authority was absolute. She decided who received a bandage and who was refused a cup of water. Under her watch, the hospital became a factory of neglect. Hundreds of sick women were loaded onto transports for killing centers. Others were simply left on the floor to die without aid. To the inmates, the hospital was not a place of healing. It was a place of fear. Why did the prisoners tremble at the sight of the nursing staff? It was a logical reaction. The medical ward was a one-way street to the crematorium. Names became symbols of terror. Margareta Gallinat was a senior guard in the later years of the war. She was infamous for a violent temper. The footage and records show a pattern. She lashed out at prisoners without provocation, using her boots and her fists. Beside her stood Erna Peterman. She rose to a supervisory position and managed daily labor assignments. This role determined the fate of every inmate. One signature meant backbreaking labor in the marshes. Another meant slightly less punishing duties in the workshops. Even small shifts in labor meant the difference between life and death. Gertrude Heise enforced this reality. She watched the ranks for the smallest infractions. A loose button or a slow step resulted in unrelenting cruelty. By the height of the war, these women formed the core power structure inside Ravensbrück. They gave orders without challenge. They assigned punishments on a whim. They decided who lived to see the next sunrise. Backed by the SS system, they operated without fear of consequences. In this world, authority was absolute. Empathy was recorded as a weakness in official reports. The screams of prisoners became background noise to their daily routines. But the calendar turned to 1943. The wider war began to shift. The German front lines were no longer advancing. Pressure mounted from the east and the west. The absolute authority of the Ravensbrück guards began to face an outside threat. The era of unchecked power was reaching its limit. 1944. The German war machine stopped its advance across Europe. Conditions outside the prison walls shifted rapidly. What began as a confident Nazi invasion became a desperate struggle for survival. Why did the camp conditions deteriorate? The answer was simple. The front lines were collapsing. The Soviet Red Army smashed through the Eastern Front. They moved closer to the German border every month. From the west, American and British bombers targeted German cities around the clock. High-altitude footage shows entire neighborhoods reduced to gray rubble. Supplies that once moved freely to the front lines vanished. Food became a luxury. It ran out for the soldiers, it ran out for the civilians. Inside Ravensbrück, life turned from bad to unbearable. The camp reached a breaking point. It was completely overwhelmed. Trains arrived daily. Each transport carried hundreds of new women into the gates. The camera would show thousands of feet marching across the gravel. Barracks built for a few dozen prisoners now held more than 100 each. There was no space to lie down. Women slept on hard wooden planks. Others lay on the cold concrete floors without blankets or coats. The air stayed thick with the smell of sickness and unwashed bodies. Lice, fleas, and filth covered every surface. Typhus and dysentery spread through the crowded rooms. The weak had no chance of survival. Hunger dictated everything. But this was only the beginning. Rations shrank to almost nothing. The daily meal was not enough to sustain a human body. In the archives, the photos show the result. Women became so thin their bones protruded through their skin. The guards became more brutal. At first glance, they were disciplined soldiers. But in reality, they were panicked and violent. Any sign of weakness became a death sentence. A stumble during the morning roll call or a look in the wrong direction triggered a strike. The sound of heavy boots and wooden batons echoed through the yard. Guards killed prisoners for minor infractions. Events accelerated. There was no turning back. The camp had become a graveyard before the executions even began. Thus ended the period of order. Public executions occurred daily. These were not simple punishments. They were televised and public signals to ensure absolute obedience. The gallows stood in the center of the camp. Thousands watched as the stools were kicked away. Fear became the primary tool of control. Every night was a gamble. Prisoners lay on wooden bunks, listening to the heavy boots of guards in the corridor. A knock on the door meant a death sentence. No one slept. They waited for the sun to rise, wondering if they would see another day. 1944. The situation deteriorated. The Soviet Red Army crossed the Polish border, moving west with heavy artillery. The Nazis began a panicked liquidation. They emptied the eastern camps to prevent the liberation of witnesses. Ravensbrück became the final destination for these transfers. Men and women from Auschwitz and Majdanek were packed into freight cars. These trains had no heating, no food, and no toilets. The doors were locked from the outside. When the bolts finally slid back at Ravensbrück, Half the passengers were already dead. The survivors were skeletal. Many could no longer walk. The camp population exploded. 6 people shared beds meant for one. Rations were cut to a single piece of moldy bread. Disease spread through the barracks. Typhus and starvation killed hundreds every morning. The crematoriums could not keep up with the pile of bodies. Early 1945. Nazi Germany was collapsing. Allied bombers destroyed the factories and the rails. The SS leadership received a final order: destroy the evidence. They began the death marches. Thousands of women were forced out of the gates and into the sub-zero wind. They walked for days without water. The sound of pistol shots echoed at the back of the column. If a woman stumbled, she was executed. If she sat down to rest, she was executed. Their bodies were left in the roadside ditches, half covered by the snow. April 30th, 1945. The war was in its final hours. Soviet tanks reached the perimeter of Ravensbrück. The soldiers cut the barbed wire and entered the barracks. The footage shows a scene of total horror. Only 3,500 women remained. Out of the tens of thousands sent to the camp, these were the only ones left. Most were too weak to stand or speak. They lay on the floor, staring at the ceiling with hollow eyes. Where were the killers? Most had vanished. Some guards stayed and were captured immediately. Others tore off their insignias and ran into the woods. They hoped to blend in with the millions of refugees clogging the roads. But the hunt began instantly. The Allies demanded justice for the crimes committed inside the wire. They needed names. They needed faces. The survivors became the most important weapon in the investigation. Memory was the key. Survivors remembered the specific way a guard held a whip. They remembered scars, high-pitched voices, and heavy limps. Investigators sat with these women for hours. They recorded every detail, building a massive database of war criminals. The British, Soviets, and Poles cooperated. They shared camp rosters, captured photographs and interrogation logs. They created a master list of the SS personnel who had served at Ravensbrück. There was no place to hide. Investigators went into the field. They didn't wait behind desks. They searched refugee centers packed with displaced people. They checked every German prisoner of war camp, looking for men using false names. Every lead was tracked to its end. The search was relentless. The evidence was undeniable. The era of the camps was over, but the era of the trials had just begun.